Hello viewers, welcome again to another program, and in today's program we'll be looking at the poem The Beard and the possible questions if it were that it is to be tested in paper 2. We'll be looking at a set of questions that are likely to be questions that you can ask in a paper 2 poetry question, of course, a question on literary appreciation. So the poem The Beard by Proscoria Rwakyaka was in appearance in paper 1 in 2021 KCSE. But again, I just thought it wise to try and look at it so that it helps us understand a few things that relate to what can be asked in paper 2. So the first thing we'll do is try running through the poem, and then we'll address ourselves to these questions. So we go. In the pulpit, he swayed and turned, leaned forward, backward, to the right, to the left. His solemn voice echoed. Lowly the congregation followed. Do you love your neighbor? Meekly, they bow at his keen eye. Now examining a grey head, heaving under her sobs, his heart leapt assured. Her sins weigh on her. So, with her he charts outside. Weep not, child, you are pardoned. But, sir, your beard conjured up the spirit of my dead dear goat. So this is a poem, and at least we've gone through it, but for you is going to sit for the exam. You may not just read this poem once and then rush to the questions. This is what I've always said, and I'll keep saying for emphasis purpose. You'll have to reread the poem and get to see what it holds. Now, The Beard is the title, and you know a beard is a part of what you can expect in a man, or maybe some of these creatures that have, for example, the goats. So the he-goats always have a beard, and here it is used as a title, and maybe it's something intriguing to find out such a title given to a poem of this that is given certain setting. And you know, somebody is swaying and turning, and actually this person is doing it at the pulpit. And this definitely is telling us that this person could be in a church. He is giving a sermon. And of course we are seeing this person doing it dramatically. It's dramatic as in we can see those movements. He's swaying and turning, forward, backward. Those are movements that are characteristic of a sermon, of a preacher who is trying to drum up a message to the audience. So you can see that he has a message, he drums it up, and we get that question here. Do you love your neighbor? Maybe this is a serious question that is posing to his congregation. And of course, he has his eye on this congregation. But then, it looks like all the congregation is avoiding his eyes. And maybe this could be a sense of guilt. Maybe these people do not love their neighbors, or they are not very sincere in their dealings with God. That's why they're avoiding the eyes of the preacher. And then, in the process of examining and maybe trying to see any of the members of the congregation saying, yes, I love my neighbor, he gets to see some head there, now examining a grey head. We're talking about some aging woman who happens to be crying. There's some kind of noisy cry. And then, in this noisy cry, the pastor's attention is drawn to this very woman. And then, his conclusion is that she's been touched by the sermon, and she's getting repentant. And of course, after the sermon, the pastor has to meet this very woman outside the church, and they have a bit of a chat. And as a pastor, you'd be expecting that this woman comes in to give a testimony, how the sermon touched her, and maybe the kind of salvation she wants. She wants to be saved. And they talk outside. We get to see the pastor is saying here, her sins weigh on her. According to the judgment of the pastor, this person is being touched by his sermon and is perhaps making confessions, is ready to make further confessions and get converted. But then the response that we gets to surprise everybody. That, but sir, your beard conjured up the spirit of my dear goat. So look, we've been thinking that she's weeping over her sins, her iniquities. But instead, we are seeing her weep over her dear goat. What could have happened to her goat? Maybe somebody stole it, or it died, or something unpleasant happened to this goat. And so, once he looked at the pastor's beard, it was just a replica of the one her goat had. And therefore, we get that these are two people who are in one context, a church context. But what their hearts explore is entirely different. Whereas the pastor thinks that she's been saved, to her, she looks at the pastor and his beard and gets to see her dear goat. So it's a total contrast. It's a total contrast of what we expected, that is a sermon that is over, and a pastor is expected to have won at least a member of the congregation. But then you can see that it is a disappointing day, because even the only one who was heaving and sobbing is turning out that all that she was sobbing over is her dear goat, not the sermon. So that is the basic interpretation you can make of this poem as we get to the questions. The first question is there: describe the setting of the poem. The setting of the poem is to do with the context. Where is this poem? This person talking to us is where. And now that I talked about the pulpit in line 1, and then there's the mention of congregation. That one straight away takes us to a church setup. It is a church setup, and we get evidence by the use of the word pulpit and the word congregation. So that is how we'll be answering question 1. So give an explanation and provide illustration from the poem. That is the basis of literary appreciation and the answering of questions in paper 2. Number 2, who is the persona in the poem? The voice that is talking to us is the persona. There's this person seeing all these things that are happening, and you cannot say that he's a member of the church. He looks like he's at some point and is observing the proceedings in the sermon. He's not part of the congregation, I may say so, because he's able to see the pastor's dramatic movements as he's making the prayer, as he's giving the sermon, and all the members of the congregation are avoiding his eye. While they're avoiding his eye, there's a sense of guilt in them. And so it's like he's just seeing all that. And even after the sermon, we are seeing him or her, that persona, bringing us to these two talking, the pastor and this old woman. So he's not part of it. So in this case, we say he's an observer. This is an observer, and as an observer, he is non-partisan in the whole event that is taking place. So in number 2, we would say that the persona here is an observer. That is what we may say of number 2. And of course, it is by the explanations that he gives here, and even seeing the sermon go on. After the sermon, the talking outside. The persona is no longer part of this. We go to number 3. What is the subject matter of the poem? So talking about the subject matter is all about talking about the theme, the main reason why the poet had to write this poem the way they have done. And given that it is a church context, and looking at all that happens here, this points us straight to what we may call religious hypocrisy. We could be in church, people go to church fine, but why do we go to church? We could be going to church possibly for some other reasons. Like now, the pastor's been preaching and even posing a question on whether they love their neighbors. the kind of response he's expecting is maybe yes or no. But they're avoiding his eyes. Why are they avoiding the pastor's eyes? Possibly there's a sense of guilt. They're in church, but their genuine presence in the church is put to question. And the only person who the pastor tends to approach after the sermon, because she was sobbing, also gives an answer the pastor did not expect. And therefore, it brings in some kind of disappointment altogether, that despite all these others avoiding his eyes, and him settling on the grey head, the aging woman, she also gives an answer that he really did not expect. So there is some religious hypocrisy. There is pretense. We don't get the genuineness in the religiosity of many people. They pretend to be religious, but genuinely they are not. People go there for their own reasons. Maybe, like this old woman could be going to church because on looking at that pastor's beard, it will always be bringing in the memory of that dear God, possibly the only one she had. So that is the way we may leave it at that. So we say that it is all about religious hypocrisy. We go to the next question. You identify and illustrate the other voices in the poem. This poem has other voices. Apart from the observer, who is the persona, we have somebody else. And these are the people. Her sins weigh on her. We can see they are put in quotes. This is the pastor speaking. The preacher is speaking. And then, weep not, child, you are pardoned. It's still the pastor. So you'll say preacher as the identification. And you'll illustrate with the quotations we have, her sins weigh on her. And then we give another illustration, if possible. Weep not, child, you are pardoned. These are words by the preacher. So that is one case of a voice we get in this poem. The other voice is, but sir, your beard conjured up the spirit of my dear goat. So when you get this one also, this is the grey-haired, the aging woman who is approached by the pastor after the sermon. What he's saying there is the quotations that we give to those lines are pointing to this other voice that is present in the poem. So far we've answered question 4. We have question 5 that is pointing to the contrasting moods in the poem. You point out the contrasting moods in this poem. It is rare, but it's also occasionally present that you can find a poem that is giving two contrasting moods. This one is an instance of such, that a pastor is preaching dramatically and with a lot of heat. In fact, is really expectant that with the kind of sermon he's drumming on his congregation, there is going to be some conversion. He is very expectant. But after the sermon, the person with whom he talks disappoints, because we get that she was not touched by the sermon, but rather was only remembering the image of her dead, her dear goat. So here is the first part. We see the mood of optimism, the mood of expectance. Optimism or expectance is what we see in the earlier part. But from the time they meet outside and the kind of information we get gives a disappointing mood. It is disappointing in the sense that the information he gets from her congregant, a member of the congregation, is quite disappointing. She didn't expect that that's what would come from her mouth. So this is the contrast we have. Optimism, optimistic mood, and then disappointing mood. That is what to get in the second part. We have another question here. Instances of irony. Irony is the opposite of the expected happening. And this particular poem, we are seeing that things that are happening. In fact, when you're talking about contrasting mood, it will still be part of that irony, that the preacher is expectant of a conversion, or a member of this congregation with whom he is talking outside is going to confess and be converted. But what he gets from her mouth is a total contrast of what he expected. She says she's only remembering her dear goat by looking at his beard. So that's not what he expected. So it is opposite of what is expected. Another irony, this is a pastor. And then he's being referred to as sir. I don't expect you to call your pastor sir. You'd rather call him reverend, call him pastor. But you can say sir. So in this case, it brings you the irony. People are in church, but their genuineness in the church is put to question. So that is the irony we see. Expectations of the pastor coming to naught. Explain the meaning of the following words. This is a question that will always be there in a poem of paper 2. That there'll be a line they'll be wanting you to paraphrase or give a meaning. And that is one we have here. Now, examining a grey head, heaving under her sobs. So this is to say that now the pastor paused to look at the members of the congregation, and he had his attention drawn to the aging woman who was sobbing. So it is about the pastor having his attention drawn to the aging woman who was sobbing. So that is what we may say. So it's like, it's a paraphrasing of what that statement means. Identify and illustrate the stylistic devices in the poem. This poem has a number of stylistic devices, and based on how many marks are in this number, you may decide on how much you are giving and which ones come first. I've said this before, that stronger stylistic devices need to be top of your list, and then the least important ones on the lower side, and that one is based on how spread are they, how strong are they in that poem. Here, this poem, we would talk about the style of dialogue. There is dialogue. It's rare, but this one is there. There's a pastor in a conversation with a member of his congregation. So dialogue there. And this dialogue is very important because it lets us understand what they are thinking. The pastor could have had a different thought about the sobbing woman, but when she speaks up, we get to know that her reaction was completely on other things that do not relate to their presence in the church. So we get to see that as one of the styles, dialogue. And then we have another style here. We have backward, echoed, followed, head, assured, bland. That is rhyme. That is rhyme in this poem. And that one is actually turning out very strongly, and we have to really appreciate that. There was another one. Having got those two, we should be getting on the third. Leaned forward, backward, swayed, turned. So that is what we call consonants. The similar sounds that we're having at the end of the words in a line. Backward, forward, and then swayed, turned. That da that is occurring at the end of those words is giving what we call consonants. It's a style. I'm sure giving it a further look, you could be seeing others. You realize I've given you 3, and it is possible that you can get many others. Simply, as I finish up, this is how it goes. All the questions I've given you cannot come. Actually, some of them replicate. Like if you have contrast, there's no way you'll be having irony. And if there's anything to do with the subject matter, possibly there are some areas that cannot come in. So this is just but giving you to prepare that when you are revising, these are the things you can possibly think about. So if you like this program, kindly, I'll ask you to give it a thumbs up. And if you'll be making any productions, you'll get notified. At the moment, have it well as we meet in the next video. Cheers.